Now we'd like to welcome our first witness, Leonie McGuire. Leonie, welcome.
Today I am talking about the Taree experience, what we had and what the community and women and children fleeing domestic violence lost. And I do thank you for this opportunity to speak today. Well, as you know, my name is Leonie McGuire. I was the manager of the Taree New South Wales Women's Refuge, also known as Lynn's Place, for 12 years until 2004. During that period, we delivered crisis and wraparound services to thousands of women and children. The women employed 20 staff, including 7 Indigenous women, an in-house counsellor with a degree in psychology, 4 qualified childcare workers, case managers, a clerical assistant, and even a gardener. We delivered leisure and educational programs with many women going on to complete certificates and university degrees. That refuge was accessible 24/7, 365 days a year, and provided outreach to residents requesting it after they were restored to safe, independent living in the community. Now, I do admit, in 2023, when speaking about services to women and children, which have been deliberately redefined and dismantled by government social policy, I often feel like an embittered old feminist who can't come to terms with the changing world and the new way of doing things. I think that the aggrieved men's groups, given succor by John Howard's government, are influencing current politicians, a kind of misogynist Trump effect. Since January the 1st of this year, in Australia alone, to today's date, men have murdered 20 women. Partners and ex-partners, now they're executioners. The local LGA, or local government area, in which Taree is located, is now in the top third of the 128 LGAs in South Wales for violence against women. Our area had a spike of 11% during the last 5 years to December 2022. We once had a Taree refuge that responded to every woman and child at risk, and they presented longer. Some history. Until 2014, New South Wales and most of regional and metropolitan Australia had a network of recurrently funded, mostly secular, feminist, specialist, domestic violence refuges accessible for 27. It was the Whitlam government, and in particular Bill Hale, who himself grown up in a home environment where he once said, "Father was not very kind to me." He was intrigued and curious about the actions of now Dr. Anne Summers and a group of courageous women who occupied a squat house in Sydney they called the Houses, that is now in the church. However, the women's refuge movement began. From the countless volunteer efforts of many women and a few men, the Taree community, initially encouraged by the mayor, a former police officer, eventually acquired a 5-bedroom purpose-built refuge with a designated children's room and large outdoor playroom. It included 2 on-site villas, and we managed 2 other off-site villas. Built in 1991, it was the last of its kind. Shared accommodation is now out of fashion. Even with its inherent disadvantages of having to share common areas, women often had the opportunity to make friends for the first time in years, and to have an enhanced feeling of safety by being together under one roof in their own room, but with an excellent system of panic buttons installed, all now lost to the Taree community and many others, I should add. The key to the establishment of those refuges such as Taree was the understanding that homelessness and domestic violence are distinct and different social ills. Women fleeing a home which has become dangerous to live in because of the behaviour of another are not homeless. It is, however, statistically, the place where a woman in Australia is most likely to be killed. The homeless, equally deserving of well-funded services, are generally suffering from drug and alcohol issues, untreated mental illness, and those seeking accommodation on release from jail. This genericizing of domestic violence victims victims and homeless has led to many women being too afraid to approach a shelter, as they are now called, even if she could get a room. These places, unlike pre-2014, are open business hours only and entry is by appointment. These shelters are unstaffed at night, and we have anecdotal evidence of women locking themselves and their children in their rooms as a fellow resident roams the house, enduring a psychotic episode or under the influence. The devil I know is what tiring women now tell me. So what was lost to women and children fleeing violence in the lush forest valley of the Manning River, where Tari is located? What did we have and what did we lose? I'll detail it. It's heartbreaking and it's dangerous. In 2014, after nearly 40 years of under-resourced but adequate current funding, the then New South Wales Conservative government struck a blow against feminism and trauma-informed domestic violence services, along with the human right of women and children to live safe from violence on threat of it. They employed KPMG and Deloitte's economic, tax and auditing companies to fashion a reform of domestic violence services, which saw 80 out of 100 specialist community-based refuges in New South Wales put out to tender for the first time and repackaged as homeless shelters. The successful tenderers were mostly large, inexperienced, faith-based organisations, which at that very time were giving evidence in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Tari lost an in-house counsellor with a degree in psychology who delivered trauma-informed counselling services to resident and non-resident women and children. Tari Refuge lost 7 Indigenous staff who made our service user-friendly because the women had local knowledge of the families and were able to deliver a culturally appropriate service. Women literally voted with their feet, accepting that the Tari Refuge was a genuinely helping and supportive service. The Indigenous staff supported all staff to consider in our service the effects of trauma experienced in so many ways by the Indigenous community. The Tari community lost 4 qualified childcare workers who ran daily programs for resident and non-resident children. They were trained to note and respond to developmental, behavioural and other issues presenting in the children, and they made many referrals to paediatricians and other paediatric services. I will relay one incident to you. It's horrific, but it demonstrates that vital role of skilled intervention. A 3-year-old is sitting in the playroom having her healthy morning tea with the other children, often 20 participants or more a day. The little girl tells one of our childcare staff, "Daddy puts his octopus in my wee-wee." I want you to be shocked as we were, but the main point is that we called the local police child protection unit. What happens to such children now? I do know that the mother of that little girl returned to her abusive husband after the justice system found that having left her abusive husband, she was now vengeful and a liar. Her return to him she saw as the only way to keep her 2 little girls safe from Daddy, who described himself as a pastor. We did regular outreach and advocacy if requested. Now, most daringly, and it was the brainchild of a Tari female police officer, and it was the first such project of its kind in Australia at the time, we developed the Tari Refuge Tari Police Partnership Against Domestic Violence, which saw 4 of my staff embedded in the Tari Police Station. 2 of the positions were designated Indigenous. Those workers dealt with all the complexities of domestic violence, which often frustrate police. Why bother with her? She'll only go back. My staff had an educative role too, and could soften police frustration by giving the information that a woman may leave and return to an abusive relationship an average of 8 times. But this may be the time that your intervention saves lives. That program was independently evaluated and found to be very effective. I still have copies of the evaluations. But after I left the refuge, and Senior Constable Suzanne Newton led the police, the project was tendered out and lost. As it illustrates the need for that refuge police project of the past, I now refer you to the Queensland Commission of Inquiry into Police Responses to Domestic Violence. That report was released in November 2022. Judge Deborah Richards led the inquiry into QPS, I'll use that acronym, and despite initial protestation, she has found clear evidence of a culture where attitudes of misogyny, sexism, and racism are allowed to be expressed and at times acted on largely unchecked. She said in the report, and I quote, "The inquiry found that those who complain are shunned and punished. The inquiry found that the GPS failed to meet its human rights obligations. Negative attitudes towards women were prevalent within the service and impacted the ability of QPS to consistently respond well to domestic and family violence." The new Labor government in New South Wales has recently announced funding for embedding civilian domestic violence workers in police stations. The devil will be in the detail. No one can feel confident the findings of the Queensland inquiry would not apply to every police station in Australia. This is precisely why the partnership of the past should be reinstated in every police station in the country. I now draw your attention to an academic paper by Dr. Susan Heubel of Sydney University. The paper titled "Feminist Gains Lost, Public Policy and the Genericizing of Women Survivors of Domestic Violence." She goes on, "This paper was written to examine the effects of being homeless as opposed to fleeing domestic violence. The needs of domestic violence survivors are primarily reduced to considerations about residential and tenancy status. The New South Wales reforms reflect a broader shift away from gendered policy and program development. Dr. Susan Heubel argues that contemporary neoliberal policy has emphasised mainstreaming and marketed relationships that challenge constructions of women as a disadvantaged group. These kinds of changes have resulted in the development of non-specific policies and service provision. This is not in keeping with the recommendations of the United Nations, which cautions against developing mainstream violence and intervention programs and services because they fail to acknowledge intersectional differences and non-specific services. And that was the Human Rights Commission in 2012. Now, in 2009, Noonan says mainstreaming and genericizing fails to frame women and children's experiences as a symptom of the problem of violence. My view is that no government, no matter how progressive, is ever going to return to a policy of recurrently funding provision of services to women and children, no matter how effective. They can stick with a cheaper model, no matter how inept. The withdrawal of government responsibility from this space has led to a mushrooming of charities, philanthropy, and a few government grants. Women fleeing violent males in Australia, especially in New South Wales, are, it seems, now charity cases. Daily, we are told governments can't do everything. It's about priorities. We are told politics is the art of the possible. Well, we know from years of experience that effective crisis and wraparound services for women and children are possible. We did it for years in Tari. It's not a puzzle. We have the template. Women and children need the will of those in power to respond to their cries for help. I am certain that on hearing or reading this statement, many politicians and people of influence will, they think, feel justifiably annoyed and irritated. They hold endless inquiries, read innumerable recommendations, yet they continue with the sleight of hand funding and under-resourcing of services. Budget after budget demonstrates the failure of Australian governments to take violence against women and children seriously and to elevate their safety to the national security agenda. Currently, even though family and domestic violence kills far more people, women, than terrorism, when our federal politicians allocate funding and national resources with catchy slogans like keeping Australians safe, they fail to take violence against women and children seriously. Their attention is directed largely at counter-terrorism measures. As for children, for far too many in Australia, home is a war zone. Children are exposed to daily situations of terror and horror during domestic violence, which produce the same symptoms of children in actual war zones. This leads to the enduring impacts of PTSD. Tari Refuge in the past identified and responded to our observations of child suffering and made appropriate referrals. To conclude, I'll quote some comments from a couple of frontline DV workers. I'll just use their initials. From L, she said, "The fact is that services are still inadequate and continue to be cut. There is an impact on children." From S, who worked in a domestic violence service for 20 years, once services were homeless services rather than domestic violence services, housing was treated separately from recovery, which usually means that the experiences which are unique to women and children living with domestic violence are never addressed within the homelessness service. If decision makers don't even know what we had and have now lost, how can informed responses be made to effectively secure the safety of women and children fleeing violent partners and ex-partners in the future? If the state's primary role is the safety of its citizens, which we've been told daily during COVID, then how do they justify their neglect of women and children? I have made a few recommendations, but perhaps I won't read them out now. I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Leonie McGuire. It's time for questions, and of course we will ask about your recommendations, but I wanted to begin and then hand over to my colleagues by coming back to your final point. One of the problems, I think, in the world today is this loss of historical memory, and it began to happen really quite seriously, unfortunately, during the Howard government era, when there was negativity towards history and the idea that history was irrelevant and simply didn't matter. But unfortunately, amongst our women, we find that this historical memory can be lacking as well. So I come to your last point. If decision makers don't even know what we had and now have lost, how can informed responses be made to effectively secure the safety of women and children fleeing violent partners and ex-partners in the future? What suggestions do you have, Leonie, for overcoming this lack of historical memory and the fact that the decision makers and those that make the budgets and government policy and government laws and those who put them into effect have no knowledge of what was done and gained, as example, your Tari Women's Refuge? What can we do about this?
Well, I think women are used to being talked at, talked over, but very rarely spoken to. And I think probably we need to ensure that the voices of the frontline workers, the survivors, the academics who do the research to substantiate these claims that we make, because everything must be evidence-based. But, I mean, people lobby politicians all the time. They have passes that enable them to roam Canberra Parliament House. Women don't have that kind of access. So maybe we should be looking at trying to influence politicians. Look, it could be a bit insidious. It could be that there aren't votes in it, that a lot of the population sees women as giving far too much attention, and angry males' voices grow louder. So I suppose that every solution is about education, but how you force politicians to be educated, I'm not sure. Now, I'm not Labor, I'm not a member of any political party because I like to be able to speak freely, but I am a friend of Labor and I go along to some of their forums, and I know they are listening, but I can see them kind of glancing away because this is going to cost money. It may alienate voters, and maybe that's just a harsh reality, except we did it. We did it in the past under Whitlam and Hayden and with successive governments, even conservative successive governments. It was only in 2014 that the Baird government, along with Prue Goward, the then Minister for Women, said, you know, let's tender these out. Let's up all this recurrent funding and tender them out. So it's not entirely lost at all. I mean, every time I go to a public meeting, I speak pretty much as I have to you today. But they go home and do their sums, count up the votes that are likely to be in it or not in it. I don't know how it works. You know more about that, Jocelynne, than I do.
Good. Thanks so much, Leonie. I mean, that is useful. The point about simply going to the meetings and speaking up as you do, although, of course, it takes a lot of fortitude, a lot of courage, a lot of energy, and a lot of effort. Well, now, over to our panel. Any questions for Leonie?
I do, Leonie. Hi, I'm Mary. How are you?
Hi.
So I'm from the NT Police, actually. And it's interesting, the part where you said there, where I say, this part here, you go, by giving the information that a woman may leave and return to an abusive relationship on average of 8 times. That's interesting because a lot of police officers, I think they forget, even though you do get that training, the initial training in police college, and you go out onto the road and you go to domestics and you see that, I think a lot of police do forget that these women are in situations where they're stuck. And that knowledge that, you might go to that same job time and time again, and then you come back and she's back with the abusive partner, or she's back there, but there's underlying factors that's why she's there, whether it's financial, just an array, personal issues, all that kind of stuff. I'd like to know your opinion on how do you combat something like that, in ensuring police are more aware that women are so stuck in this cycle, even though they're given that training, but women are so stuck in that cycle that they might have to go back for whatever reason there is. And how do you implement that in the police force more? And how do you work closely with, because we do have women's shelters in the NT, but not like Tyree, but how do you have police officers understanding that cycle and how they work closely with women's shelters? Because I think there is a lack of that.
Look, I think that Tyree Police Partnership answers quite a few of the questions you're putting to now, because 4 of my refuge staff were working from within the police station, which is a very ancient old building. They were given their own room, these 4 workers, which they decorated with lounges and vases of flowers and posters. And I think embedding civilian domestic violence workers is really probably the most effective thing you can do, because when a woman approached the counter, because word went round a community like Tyree, there's 4 workers up there, 2 of them Indigenous, you're safe with them. But they used to hand over all that messy stuff, the advocacy, the follow-up. They would often go out and secure a scene, and then the civilian DV workers could go in and talk with the women and children. And they had an educative role, because this whole business about, what's the use of worrying about her, she'll only go back. I remember one of my staff members saying to her, we talk to those police officers who are expressing that frustration. We tell them about what you just said. And it's documented. It can take an average of 8 times. There are a multitude of reasons why women leave. And putting it to them that the time you go out and respond with knowledge and compassion, you may save the life of that woman and her 3 children. So they kept talking and gently but educatively to the police who were up there at Tyree Police Station. Now, at first, they were very resentful. We've got to share our radios. They've given these workers a car. They couldn't see it at all. But I don't think anything in the end resisted. And when it was tendered out, which is a good way to get rid of a good working program, they were really sorry about it. But they're not political creatures. They're paramilitary. So my answer to your question essentially is, for goodness sake, state governments, embed civilian domestic violence workers in police stations. And Professor Kerry Carrington has done a lot of work about police stations for women in Argentina, where that's all they deal with. They're little cottages in the suburbs where women can go and express their concerns. They can get childcare. And also the police in those police stations go out to the homes and say, listen, Pablo, if we see you again, you're going to be sorry. They have that community-based policing. The only problem with that is these are designated police in Argentina, but they are funded by charity. They're not funded by the state like the other police are. And I got quite a shock when that was made clear. But Kerry Carrington has done a lot of research. And I think it would take a lot of load off the police who are not trained. They don't even have the culture to respond to emotions and distress. They don't. And added to that inquiry in Queensland did find a culture of racism, misogyny, and anti-women. That can't be argued. That's there. So that's their job to educate their police about how they should be, or ours should be given to your own training when you're in training. I don't know what you get at the moment, but I think Goulburn Academy does like an hour over the whole course, on domestic violence, I mean. So education and embedding civilian DV specialists into police stations, that's my answer.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. I'm Kerry Heubel. I wondered if you're aware of the statistics that would indicate there has been an increase of domestic violence in the last, say, 20 years or 30 years in New South Wales, because prior to a change of government at one point, there were women's officers in most departments trying to influence policies of those departments. And there was, of course, also a women's advisory body to the Premier. Now, they would, of course, be working to establish what you went with, what you developed, the refuges in Taree and the various other places. They were abolished. They've been, they're gone, which means that you don't really have a voice back to the people who are making the policies. Would you suggest another way of getting your need through other than simply lobbying? Would you see a much better way, a more effective way?
Well, I think that the safety of women and children should be enshrined in legislation, for starters. And then, of course, every government should exactly what you're talking about, those positions in the government's inner circle that were advised on women's issues. And you use the word the voice, which is really interesting because it's very relevant at the moment. It is. Don't have a voice, no power. Yeah. So I would suggest those specialists, I can't remember the name of it again, sorry, you referenced it, that Department for Women within the government, I'm losing my vocabulary here, you referenced it, Kerry, that particular group of women that were in the cabinet, not the cabinet, they were inside Parliament, an advisory body in Sussex Street, weren't they?
There was a woman in every government department, and she wasn't called a woman's officer, but what she did was bring to attention of the powers that be within the department what it was that women wanted. And what they did, for example, I know one issue very well because eventually it became a case before the Anti-Discrimination Board, as it was. Hill, the name of the case is Hill, and she was a wonderful woman, a clerk class 4, and she made really strenuous efforts to ensure that women had sufficient loos in the building, because there were insufficient loos for women. They were all for men, which I suppose was understandable on the one hand because there'd only been men in the department and now women were coming in. But she was treated in a most vicious and horrible manner by some of the men in the department. Not all of them, I would hope, but it went eventually, Jane Hill, to the Anti-Discrimination Board. But that was an initiative of the Rann government. And when Rann came into government, he ensured that there was a proper Women's Advisory Council to the Premier. And as Kerry Heubel said, she was the executive officer. Carmel Nyland was the head of it. And so, but what do you reckon? Oh no, I should hand over to Helen Pringle for her, Dr. Pringle for her questions, and then we'll come to you for your recommendations.
How much time? I'm Helen Pringle, and good to see you here. I'm just wondering about the role of the police, because as you know, there's a lot of concern about the police as in a number of contexts. And Mary probably knows more about this than I do, but I want to ask the question anyway. But there's a concern about the police not taking domestic violence seriously, being perpetrators themselves, also exacerbating situations, perhaps, and particularly in Indigenous policing, so that there has been a kind of I would say it's growing, and I watch it with, I have to say, concern of what's called anti-carceralism. You know, in other words, taking away the carceral imprisonment approach in terms of this area in particular. I mean, more generally, it's a more general approach, but I've always been worried about that approach, because it seems to then create, you know, free range assailants, abusers who just, I mean, what do you do with them? And so this is sort of a little bit shifting the focus to the perpetrators, because you're, you know, when you assist those who are the victims or the targets, don't even just say, of the action, but what's to be done about the perpetrators, do you think? In a context where there is concern about whether the police is the best agency and the best agents to do that. Mary might like to add a little bit about that.
Oh, let's come to Leonie. Yes, Leonie, how do you respond?
Look, I'd like to make the point that the evaluations of that refuge police partnership show that there was far less recidivism when the perpetrators, victims, had the support of the civilian domestic violence workers located within the police station. So they seemed to have, but it never really came around. Well, it often didn't need to be exercised because it was all about relationships. And Aboriginal actually began approaching the police station because we had 2 Indigenous civilian domestic violence workers there. As for perpetrators, I think a great deal of money is spent on them, which is totally wasted, and I think that there is research to show that. They measure the number of perpetrators going in, they measure the numbers who went out, but they never go back to them 2 months later or 6 months later or a year later and ask the families, well, was that a successful program? And in fact, there's evidence showing a lot of them even craftier in their ability to abuse. They start using terminology, you know, for pushing my buttons. They find ways to manipulate women that they weren't even aware of before they did their behavioural management training. Now, that's pretty controversial, I agree, but it would be very nice if someone would go back and measure the behaviour of those perpetrators 6 months after they've done the course and a year after they've done the course. It's not happening. Now, I also make the point that if you all leave today and you go out and your car's been stolen, are you going to refer that car thief to some counselling course so that he will, you know, amend his car stealing behaviours? Of course, you want a criminal justice response. And obviously, Indigenous women do not want to see their men in prison for very good historical and current reasons, which is where the civilian domestic violence workers come in again, because they're working with family. And it was interesting in Tari because I had 7 Indigenous workers there, and some of them lived out on the mish, as they call it, and had some concern about, you know, how might the men react to that, because they're giving services to their wives. None of them reported any difficulty at all. And it appeared to be almost that the men respected the fact that there was an organisation in town that welcomed their families, even if they personally weren't welcome. So, look, it's complex. It worked, though. And we even had one woman who, gosh, she was 60 at the time, she was in a wheelchair, and she had a safe house out at Perclate, the Moosh, as they call it, so that if the woman couldn't get into town quickly or the police refused to go out, which happens all the time in Kempsey police will not go out to the Aboriginal Mish, as they call it, unless they have 2 police cars available. Well, I don't know, but they will not go out. So women knew they could go to Auntie Kat's house, who's in a wheelchair, she's 60, and she would give a bed and breakfast for the night, and we would reimburse her for that. And the perpetrators never went in Auntie Kat's house, even though she's living in the midst of them at that mission. So there are unusual things going on that I don't particularly understand, but we never had any difficulty at that refuge. We got around town that we had an excellent system of panic buttons, and that if you did come up and bother us, you would be greeted by security who, if they couldn't handle you, would hand you on to police. And we just didn't have any problems. Everyone knew where the refuge was. Every taxi driver knows where the refuge is in Taree. So now I think waffling right off the topic. I think it was about perpetrators, wasn't it? And I just say, sure, give them a course, but let them do it in jail.
I think your point was very apposite, that if somebody's, robbed a bank, they don't say send him off to counselling so that he won't rob a bank in the future, which is what you were saying. Yeah, I think Leonie, we've got our next witness coming, Dr. Michelle Fernando. So what we might do is say thank you very much to you, and with your recommendations, if you could provide them to us, and then if there's an opportunity later today, we could read them out so that they're a part of this recorded record, but we'll certainly take them into account in writing our submission to the committee on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in their review of Australia's performance under that convention. So, thanks so much, Leonie, for being with us today.
Thank you, and I'll send them over to Anna. I'll email them to Anna.
That's lovely.
Recommendations. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. It was an honour to speak to you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, Leonie.
Bye.
Thank you.